Habakkuk is crying out to God, bring my people back, bring your people back, bring them back to yourself. He's crying out, he's praying to God, God, do a work in their hearts, and he's expecting revival. God does not bring revival. In fact, God answers in a way that Habakkuk doesn't understand. He says to Habakkuk, listen, you aren't going to get what I'm doing, but I want you to know that I'm bringing the Babylonians from the north, and they are going to attack my people. They're going to kill some of my people. They're going to cart some of my people away into and spread them out through the Babylonian Empire. But I want you to know that I'm doing this out of love for my name and love for my people, because there is going to be a remnant who through this, I'm going to win their hearts back. And we know the name of some of those men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And God says, Habakkuk, listen, you're not going to understand it. You've got to trust me. You've got to trust me. And really, if we were to put a name on the book of Habakkuk regarding its theme, that would be the theme. Habakkuk, trust me. And in these pandemic days, when we don't understand necessarily what God is doing, that's our mantra as well. Let's trust him. And then when we left last week, our study in verse 5, remember Habakkuk had stationed himself on that tower, suspended between heaven and earth, between the chaos that is going on earth and heaven where God is ruling from the throne. And he says, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to stand here until my God answers me. He is confident that God hears him. He is confident that God answers him. He's going to wait. And he's going to put his trust in the God who answers, even though he may not understand God's answer. And so in verse 2 of chapter 2, God begins his answer and essentially says this. Here's what you can write down in your notes. God's answer in verses 2 through 5 is that the unrighteous will live by their pride, but the righteous will live by their faith. And again, you'll remember that Paul in Romans 1 verse 17 picks up on Habakkuk 2 verse 4 and says, the just shall live by faith. All right, so there is the distinction between Babylon and Judah. My people are going to live by their faith, while Babylon is going to live by her pride. But I want you to know now in verses 6 through 20, here's the second part of God's answer in chapter 2. Judgment day is coming. Judgment day is coming, God says. So let all the earth keep silence before me. The day is coming, God says to Habakkuk. Listen, it is coming. It may seem slow to you, he said back in verses 2 through 5. But know that in verse 6, all the nations will take up their taunt. God's people from all nations will stand and mock the Babylonians. Will not all of them, look at verse 6 there, will not all of them taunt him with scoffing? There are, even here in Habakkuk, listen, there are apocalyptic overtones here. So we're going to talk just a little bit about Revelation tonight. We know that in the end, we've read the back of the book and God wins, and the evildoer is going to pay for his evil. Here in Habakkuk 2, God is pointing us to the end of his story. The story of God executing his justice and his wrath upon the earth, of God ridding the world of his enemies, of God exacting vengeance on those who have wronged and mistreated his people. So here's what I want us to understand tonight from this text. It may often seem to us as if God doesn't care about justice. Abortion, euthanasia, many young ladies today who are being kidnapped and sold into slavery, literally here in America, even in our cities. Does God care about justice? And sometimes I think we're so scared of the social gospel and social justice that if we're not careful, we can kind of poo-poo the idea that God is a God of justice. He cares about justice. And God cares about justice because he cares about people. In fact, he's going to give us here 5 woes that he lays out against Babylon because of the way they have treated his people. and the way they have treated other people as well. God cares about justice because God cares about people. There's an interesting, I preached a sermon not too long ago, a couple of years ago now, on Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, where God gives specific laws to Israel regarding the parapet on the top of their roofs of their homes, that they were to build that parapet, which is like a short wall, to keep people from falling off the wall and being injured or dying. Why would God make a law that says when you build your home, you've got to put a fence on the top of your home to keep people from falling off? Because God cares about people. God loves people. God cares about justice. In fact, he wants us to care about justice as well. When he says in Micah 6, verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. God takes justice seriously, and we need to take justice seriously. What will happen to those who don't? What does God promise here to those who mistreat and abuse and use people for their own means and for their own ends? Well, let's see here. God pronounces 5 woes. By the way, this is all about woe tonight. Aren't you glad you joined us on a rainy Wednesday night? You know, you may look at this and say, oh, this reminds me a lot of Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh, where, he's always saying, woe is me. You may say this is like Johnny Raincloud or I don't know. But when we are talking about woe here, even though it's WOE, the way we should respond to that is WHOA, woe, right? Woe, God is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. He is about to pronounce judgment upon the earth, upon the evildoer. It is Hebrews 10, verse 31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Don't take God lightly. Don't take his laws lightly. Don't take his justice lightly. All right? So in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, his train filling the temple, remember what Isaiah's response is when he sees the king in all of his glory? He says, woe is me, I am undone. Woe. All right, so that's what we should feel tonight. This is a hard passage. You're probably not going to hear a lot of preaching or teaching on this passage because it's a hard passage, but also know that in Matthew 23, Jesus pronounces 7 woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees there. So our God is a God of justice. Let me read the text for you beginning in verse 6. We'll just read down through verse 8 as we cover this first woe. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, scoffing and riddles for him, and say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own? For how long? And he loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, Babylon, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe number 1, here's what God says to the Babylonians. The plunderers will be plundered. The plunderers will be plundered. Woe to him. Woe to you, Babylon, because you are never satisfied. There's never enough violence to satisfy you. There's never enough money to satisfy you. There are never enough people to rule over to satisfy you. It is never enough. You're never satisfied. You're always thirsty for more. And so the big question we should be asking ourselves as we read this text, when is enough enough? How much will be enough? So we need to ask this, how does this apply to us? Well, how much money will be enough for us in our jobs, in our careers? How high up the corporate ladder will be high enough for us? Are we satisfied with God? Is he enough? Are we looking to other things? Are we going to use other people to build our own kingdoms? Are we going to plunder in order to build what we want so that we have more. How much is enough? And I think Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 answers that question for us as believers in Jesus. Let your conversation, let your conduct, let your life be without covetousness, because he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so you be satisfied with that. He is enough. He is the one who says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I am enough. Be content with what you have. The plunderers, the Babylonians, God says, they will be plundered. How long will you heap up what is not your own? How long will you load yourself with pledges? All right. Second woe God pronounces against Babylon. The exploiters will be exploited. The plunderers will be plundered, and the exploiters will be exploited. It's in verses 9 through 11. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him, in other words, woe to him, God says, who prospers on the backs of others. It's what we call evil gain, dishonest gain. Again, God hates this. When people are used and abused to build my own kingdom in my own way, to set myself up above others, using others as a ladder to climb on for my own personal success, just to get to the top. This is one of the reasons I believe God hates gambling. In gambling, what am I doing? In order to win in gambling, I must be capitalizing on another person's loss. I must be building my wealth on their back, on their loss. Dishonest business practices, whatever it takes to get ahead. It's a dog eat dog world out there. No, we've seen this played out even in the COVID crisis, haven't we? With the PPP, the Payment Protection Program, and the Small Business Association, the loans that are guaranteed by the government. Did you hear about Shake Shack? Did you hear about Harvard? Which I believe, if I remember correctly, Harvard has the greatest endowment of any college in America, and they applied and they received money from the government as a small business to help those who were in trouble financially during these days. Now, they were caught, and so was Shake Shack, and so were several others. But here's what we're talking about. That is a real life, modern day, right here in America example of the Babylonians here. They are doing whatever it takes to get ahead, using whatever people, stepping on whoever it requires. All right? God is saying, listen, Babylonians, even though I am the one who has ordained you to bring this discipline upon my people, you need to understand this, that I'm a God of justice, and that my people are not yours to use. That's why verse 10 says, when you use and abuse people, you have, notice verse 10, you have forfeited your life. These are God's people. Every person on the face of the earth belongs to him, whether or not they trust in him, whether or not they believe in him, whether or not they've confessed faith in Jesus Christ. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all those who dwell within. They're not to be used for my personal gain. They don't belong to me. They belong to him. And even the stones, notice here in the text, even the stones, verse 11, will cry out against the people who have abused others. The families who have been destroyed will cry out against you, just like Abel's blood. When Cain killed Abel, just like Abel's blood cried out to the Lord from the ground. These inanimate objects, notice in verse 11, the stones will cry out from the wall because they've witnessed what you've done to people. The beams from the woodwork will respond because they saw with their own eyes what you have done and how you have used people Listen, exploiting others for personal gain invites God's judgment. Doesn't mean God can't forgive us and won't forgive us when we come to him after using others and abusing others. He will. But listen, God takes exploiting others very, very seriously. Let me just give you two names: David and Bathsheba. Did God take David's exploitation of Bathsheba and Uriah seriously? Even after forgiving David of his sin? Absolutely. David lives the rest of his life with consequences. A baby dies. He has trouble in his family. He's kicked off of his own throne by one of his sons. There is murder in his home. There is adultery in his home. There's fornication in his home. There is no peace whatsoever the rest of David's life because he exploited Bathsheba and Uriah. God takes this very, very seriously. So listen, we don't use the freedoms that we enjoy here in America, living in a capitalistic society, the freedoms we enjoy here to have freedom of speech, to have freedom of worship, to work whatever job we want to work. We don't use those freedoms and those privileges to use and abuse others. Whatever freedoms and privileges we have in the Christian life, we don't use those to use and abuse others. We use it to serve others. We use those freedoms for the benefit of others. It's Galatians 5:13. For you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love. Here's how you use your freedom. You serve one. You don't use one another, you serve one another. The exploiters will be exploited because God is a God of justice. And then woe number 3 in verses 12 through 14, where God says, woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Here we get apocalyptic again. As the waters cover the sea, so will the earth be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Woe number 3, victimizers will be victimized. Woe to him who builds a life or a reputation or a career or even a church. So I'm going to talk to pastors right here, right now. When you build a church, or Sunday school teachers, when you build a Sunday school class, or youth pastors, when you build a youth group, whatever it is, whatever people you're working with, when you build a church by victimizing others, woe to you. By controlling others, by lording over others. 1 Peter 5 warns against that for pastors. Woe to pastors who build a church by manipulating and controlling people. You don't build a town with blood. You don't found a city on iniquity. It's not the Lord's idea. It's not the Lord's doing that people would labor and work, and then everything that they have, you come in and you burn up. That's not the Lord's doing. Read Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says that the man who labors, he gets reward for his labor. Even though if he's not a believer in Jesus, it's a short-lived reward, but he is to be rewarded for his labor. You don't take that away from people. You don't build your church. You don't build your ministry. You don't build a career or a reputation by victimizing others. So let me ask the hard questions. How are you building your career? What steps are you taking to advance in your company? Are you using people? Are you abusing people? How about your reputation? How are you building your reputation? Are you using others and abusing them to lift you up in the eyes of other people? Are you doing that through God-honoring hard work, through integrity, through honesty. You're working your way up the corporate ladder. Or are you doing that by bad mouthing or demeaning or cutting down others, by making much of their faults and their shortcomings? Do you spend more time searching out the speck in your brother's eye than you do looking in the mirror for the beam in your own eye? Can I be totally frank with you? Over the last 10 years in the church, I have witnessed drama, interpersonal drama, like no time in the first 15 years of my ministry. Like no time I can remember growing up. And remember, I'm a PK, I'm a pastor's kid, so I grew up in the church. As far back as I can remember, my life has revolved around the church. But within the last 10 years in the Church of Jesus Christ, and it's not just the churches where I've been a part of, it's interactions I've had with other pastors, interactions I've had with people from other churches. I'm amazed by the amount of fault finding that's become commonplace in America's churches today. The tattling, the nitpicking, the backbiting, and almost always when the motive is revealed, it's really nothing more than what we see on television on CNN and Fox News and C-SPAN. It's politics. It's somebody attempting to position themselves for gain and using others to do that. That's a Babylonian mindset that will invite God's judgment and God's justice. We don't build churches that way. We don't build ministries that way. God wouldn't let Babylon build her empire that way, even though he ordained they be the ones to come in and take his people. God says, I cannot let that go. I will judge because I am just. That's woe number 3. Woe number 4, manipulators will be manipulated. The manipulators will be manipulated. Verse 15, 16, and 17. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. You drink yourself and show your uncircumcision, because the cup is in the Lord's right hand, and it will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. The manipulators will be manipulated. The Babylonians had forced their enemies to become drunk. Now, there's some debate in theological circles and among scholars whether or not this is metaphorical or it is actual. Did the Babylonians, as a part of their war tactics, come in and force people to drink alcohol and then exploit those people and manipulate those people and take advantage of those people? I personally think that was probably a part of their MO. Some theological scholars believe this is just God speaking metaphorically. But I believe they had forced their enemies, even the Israelites, the Jews, to become drunk so that they could gaze on their nakedness. So the woe here is to him who uses others to satisfy his own pleasures. The more alcohol that people drink, and we know this to be true, the more they lose their inhibitions. That's why there are so many scriptures in God's word that warn against the misuse of alcohol. Too much alcohol causes a person to lose control. And they can then be manipulated. They become under the control of others. They become under the control of the alcohol itself, and they lose their inhibitions. It's Ephesians 5, verse 18. Do not get drunk with wine, wherein is a debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. You live under the control of the Spirit. God is not standing by idly watching as the Babylonians manipulate people using alcohol. God is promising his judgment. He himself pictures himself right here as holding the cup of wrath. He is going to make Babylon drunk. with his wrath, not with alcohol. He's going to make them drunk with his wrath. And he will then turn Babylon's glory into shame. They will drink his wrath to the last drop. This is the same reason, listen, this is the same reason God hates pornography. It's the same reason that God hates adultery. It's the same reason God hates flirting with someone who is not your spouse. Same reason God hates sex before marriage. You finding pleasure in exposing someone else. Literally exposing them. It's taking something that belongs to them, that is intended to be for them, and stealing it from them, using that to satisfy my own pleasures. I don't have the right to that. You don't have the right to that. The Babylonians didn't have the right to do this with God's people, to make them drunk and to manipulate them for their own sexual perversions. No. I don't have the right to do that, to use people for my own personal pleasures. It doesn't have to be sexual in nature. I can manipulate people for any reason, to serve my selfish desires, for my own personal gain. And God hates this. It invites his judgment. Manipulating and exposing others for my personal satisfaction is no small thing. Listen, God says in 1 Peter 4, verse 8, that you don't expose others. Love covers a multitude of sins. It doesn't expose that. So we cover. We don't expose people. That's woe number 4. The manipulators will be manipulated. And then woe number 5, God says, the idolaters will be silenced. The idolaters will be silenced, or the God silencers will be silenced. An idolater is a God silencer, according to Romans chapter 2, verse 14, because God has written his law on our hearts. And so Romans chapter 1 says that the unbeliever then silences God's work in the consciences and in the heart. So the God silencers or the idolaters will be silenced. Verses 18 through 20. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Notice that he trusts in his own creation. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Woe to him, God says, who puts his trust in a lifeless thing. What's the very first commandment God gives back in Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5 and 6? You shall have what? You shall have no other gods before me. You say, whew, Pastor Ken, finally we get to a woe that, hey, I'm all good on, right? I don't struggle with idolatry. I don't have this little idol thing, this little statue I put up on my mantle of my fireplace, and I don't bow down before it every day. But listen carefully. Idols aren't just things we create with our hands. Idols are things we create with our hearts. One scholar has said that the human heart is a factory of idols. An idol is anything that I want so badly that I am willing to displease or disobey God in order to have it. Or an idol is anything that when I cannot have what I want, that I respond sinfully to that. Idolatry isn't just skin deep. It goes all the way to the bone. It goes all the way to the heart. So before we say, yeah, you world out there, you idolaters out there, you build your life with your idols and on your idols, with all your stuff you're here accumulating, and you step on people in order to get ahead in this world because it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Yeah, you world out there, you need to listen to what God has to say, because payday is coming, God says. Judgment day is on its way. But remember, who does God give these words to? He is speaking about Babylon, but he's giving his words to Habakkuk and to Judah. It is a warning to Habakkuk and a warning to Judah. Don't become like the Babylonians. When you see them prospering, you don't set your heart on the things they set their hearts on. You don't act like they act. You don't do what they do. Now, you give your heart to me. Because look what happens when you start messing around with idols. Once you give your heart to an idol, look at what else follows. Look at all these woes. You begin victimizing people, you begin abusing people, you begin manipulating people, you begin plundering people, exploiting people, and that will invite my judgment. Idolatry never lives alone. Don't let your heart fall in love with what you see from the Babylonians. And just in case you're tempted to do that, remember verse 20. I, the Lord, Jehovah God, am in my holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before me. We need this vision of our God. We need a vision, a fresh vision as the church of a God who takes himself seriously, who takes his people seriously, and he takes seriously those who harm and injure both his name and his people. God is in his holy temple. This is not the picture of a lovey-dovey, teddy bearish, crawl up into grandpa's lap kind of God. This is the picture of a God with an iron fist. This is the picture of a God sitting behind his judgment desk, ready to bring the gavel down in full force. It's what Peter writes in 1 Peter 4, verse 17. It is time for judgment to begin, and it's going to begin at the household of God. So, Habakkuk, here's what I want you to take away from this. Wait for it. The Babylonians, what they are sowing, they will reap. Judgment day is coming. Wait for it. And secondly, not only will there be hell to pay for the Babylonians, but take my words seriously, Habakkuk, as one of my people. Don't be caught off guard. Don't get comfortable. Don't begin falling in love with the things you see going on around you and think that, hey, because they're getting away with it, evidently God's okay with it. No. Run to me for safety. I will care for you. I will protect you. I will preserve you. You guard your heart and don't let it wander from me when you see the ungodly prospering. Because judgment day is coming. Notice verse 14 here. Notice what God says. So that the earth, why is judgment day coming? So that all the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. I'm going to pour out my wrath, Habakkuk. I'm going to pour out my wrath upon the evildoer so that my name will be great in all the earth, to the four corners of the earth. Over every ocean, through every river, over every stream, my name will be great. It's what David said as he ran to Goliath, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That's why I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Friends, that day is coming. We read Revelation 21, we read Revelation 22, and there is in the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem, there will be no night there. The gates will be open. They will never be closed. And everything that is detestable and deplorable, everything evil will be done away. It will be eradicated forever and ever. And the glory of the Lord will be great unto the ends of the earth. Because God is a God of justice. Because God is a God of glory. Because God is a God of wrath. So here's how we should respond now. Stop doubting. Start trusting. Stop complaining and start praising, because things are going according to plan. God will have the final say. He is not indifferent to sin, regardless of what it may look like to us. He is not insensitive to our suffering, even when we're suffering at the hands of evildoers. God is in control of both the time and the people of this world. He will accomplish his purposes, every single one of them. Here's what we need to do then. Be still and know that he is God. Don't let our heart go wandering, because we're wondering if God will have the final say. Don't fall in love with what we see the evildoers doing and get what they seem to be getting away with. Guard your heart. Don't give your heart to a lifeless thing. And what's really cool is that for those of us who live on this side of Habakkuk, we don't need to fear. As followers of Jesus, believers in Jesus, we don't need to fear God's wrath. God's wrath has been taken and absorbed in full by Jesus. Jesus drank the cup. Do you remember when he cries out in the garden, Father, if it be your will, let this what? Let this cup pass from me. Jesus drank the cup of the Father's wrath in full. He drank it to the very last drop. He answered for our sins. He answered for our idolatry. He answered for our victimizing of others. He answered for our manipulating of others. There is no justice left for us to face. Jesus paid it all. Romans 3 says that God is both the just and the justifier. And so, because he is just, he sent Jesus, who paid the price for our sins in full. He is just. We don't need to back away from that doctrine that he's a God of wrath, that he is holy. We don't need to cower in the face of it. We don't need to apologize for it. We can embrace that and we can celebrate that, because if God were not a God of wrath and holiness and righteousness and justice, there would be no Jesus. But because he is, he, in love and mercy and kindness, sent Jesus. And he poured out his wrath upon Jesus so that we could be free from that. So let us live that way. Let us now, with our God, take up the cause of justice and live according to justice. Micah 6:8, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. Amen.